I recently went to the British Museum and saw all of the Assyrian carvings and bas-reliefs that were there, and I came away with an awful lot of footage that I really wanted to make a few videos about, because these reliefs are so well crafted and so well preserved that a picture really is worth 1,000 words. It's really amazing what we can learn about the Assyrian army from these contemporary sculptures. For anyone who doesn't know, the Assyrians are a very ancient people from northern Iraq, who weren't particularly noteworthy until after the Bronze Age collapse, which affected the Assyrians a lot less than it did those cultures nearer to the Mediterranean Sea, and by about 900 BC the Assyrians had created a very large and powerful kingdom that went on to subjugate, well, practically everybody. The Assyrians did to the Middle East what the Romans would later do to the Mediterranean. They brought it under the leadership of one great power, so it could be connected by roads, trade and cultural influences. And like the Romans, this wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for the supremacy of the professional Assyrian army, which was easily the best of its time. And it was born out of the citizen army of the Assyrian state, as displayed here from the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, approximately 100 years before the Assyrian army was turned into a professional fighting force. I'll go into detail about these shortly, but I just wanted to give you an impression of how proud the Assyrians were of their army. They put so much detail into displaying rank upon rank of soldiers, all of them with absolutely no emotion on their faces whatsoever. The Assyrian soldiers are robots as far as the artists, or probably more accurately, the king who commissioned the artists to create these bas-reliefs things. They don't ever show any kind of emotion when dealing with adversity. But even before it was a professional force, the Assyrian army was sufficiently advanced to make it the terror of the Near East. For example, what we're looking at here is a fortified camp that the Assyrian army would create each night when on the move. This is what the Roman military did 500 years later to protect them from any sudden disasters while out on campaign. A fortified camp prevents the enemy from destroying your army while you are still encamped, which is what Scipio did to the Carthaginians before Zama, and it also provides you with a safe haven to retreat to if there is a reverse on the battlefield. These three quadrants seem to be dealing with fairly domestic duties, such as preparing food, storing provisions, or cleaning equipment. You might be forgiven for thinking that the bottom left quadrant is also a scene of food preparation, but it's actually not. What this is a priest known as a haruspex. At least that was the Latin name for what this priest is doing, which is cutting open an animal and examining its entrails in order to divine the future. Usually the animal's liver was the organ of choice when it came to where the gods would tell people about the future. Apparently in ancient Mesopotamia the liver was considered the source of blood, and therefore the source of life itself. And so obviously that's where the gods would tell you whether you were going to win tomorrow's battle or not. It sounds silly to us, but ancient people in general took religion very, very seriously. And as you can see, in regards to the maintenance of the army, the religious and spiritual aspect is as important as the temporal aspects of feeding and clothing the troops. We can fast forward ahead almost 200 years to see the now professional army of Sennacherib, and the army looks almost exactly the same as the army did under Ashurnasirpal. Each heavy infantryman has a conical bronze helmet, scale armour over the torso, and a leather kilt and boots covering the legs. And he was armed with a relatively short spear, which probably isn't even the height of a man, and a short bronze sword as a backup weapon. But by far the most interesting piece of the Assyrian heavy infantryman's equipment is a very large and deep conical shield. Now these were very interesting for a few reasons. The conical shield is a much more advanced piece of technology than your average flat bossed shield. When struck, the energy dealt to a flat shield is almost entirely localized in one small area, meaning that the shield itself will be excessively damaged in one spot. A cone-shaped shield acts more like a cymbal, meaning that when it's struck, the energy of the blow is dissipated around the entire circumference of the shield, meaning of course that it's less likely to break. So after the unending ranks of nigh invulnerable and expressionless Assyrian heavy infantry, we finally come to the Assyrian light infantry. These are equipped quite differently to the heavy infantry. The only thing that's similar is the spears and the short swords. Unlike the heavy infantry wearing scale, these guys are really lightly armoured. They have a small metal disc held in place by leather straps over the chest, and they have much smaller flat shields, as well as shorter helmets. I'm not sure whether these are skirmish infantry or flanking infantry. It could be that they're quite lightly armoured so they could attack the flanks and rear of an enemy line, or they could be skirmish infantry whose job was to go out before the main body of troops and throw spears to disrupt the opponent's formations. Or maybe they did both, but one thing we can be certain of is that these chaps were not line infantry. Also, something else I've just noticed is if we look back at the previous two infantrymen, they're not wearing armour, or if they are wearing armour, it's really not very obvious. However, if we look slightly back towards these chaps, these are clearly wearing metal armour, or armour that is more highly decorated, which would imply seniority of the rear ranks, much in the same way the Romans had the Hastati, Principes, and the Triarii. Other options are that these people are either conscripts or recruits from the local area, or auxiliaries from allies who have been temporarily drafted into the army. We then come to the Slingers, who are actually surprisingly well armoured in what appears to be scale of their own, with decent helmets and short swords. But as someone who has actually had quite a lot of practice with a real sling, what I'm very surprised about is how short the slings they are using are. It could be that the Assyrian slingers were like the Balearic Islanders, and they carried multiple slings on their person of different lengths depending on what the situation requires. Short slings don't give you very good range, but they do give you excellent accuracy, whereas a long sling will give you the reverse. We then reach the vanguard of the army, which is the archers, and they are at the front because they are busy engaged in storming a city. The archers attacking the city are armed in a very interesting way as well. For a start, they seem to be armoured much like the slingers and the heavy infantry. They're wearing the same sort of scale armour, and they've got conical helmets of their own. What surprises me is how primitive the bows appear to be. For a start, they're very short, and they're not at all recurved. Basically, I think that these bows must have had a relatively low draw weight, so the actual poundage of the draw must have not been very high, and obviously that means it wouldn't have put very much energy into each arrow. It could just be the way that it's been carved, but it looks like the arrow is on the outside of the bow, with the arrow held in place by the upstretched thumb of the archer, and the archers have a quiver full of arrows on their backs. These things would make me think that the Assyrian archers were trained for rapid fire, rather than power and accuracy. And if the numbers represented on these reliefs are anything to go by, the Assyrian army was approximately half archers. And finally, the archers are standing behind two infantrymen who are holding spears and particularly large pavis shields that curve over at the top, presumably to protect the archers from return fire. This is something we see done in multiple different reliefs from multiple different time periods, so it must have been a tactic that served the Assyrians quite well as they besieged giant cities full of people who didn't want to get besieged by the Assyrians. The rest of the relief is dedicated to the city that the Assyrians are storming, and it's really rather big, or at least represented in that way. You can see an Assyrian light infantryman who's captured a parapet. You can see here as the Assyrians continue to advance on the city that you've got rocks and spears being thrown back and forth between the defenders and the assailants. And they are obviously attacking up at the defenders on the walls, which you can't really see very well because the relief itself is really badly damaged, and they probably weren't all that detailed to begin with. Here we have Sennacherib's Royal Guard on procession, presumably after a successful campaign. Here's the heavy infantry followed by a chariot crew. Although this part of the relief has broken off and we're missing it, we can tell that this is part of the king's chariot. Look how well decorated these horses are. I'm not sure if this front chest piece is actually armour or just decoration, but these are definitely decorative tassels and coverings, and the horses pulling this chariot also have some sort of face covering. Now whether that's armoured or decorative, I don't know, but these are some pimped out horses. Following the king we see a guard or servant specifically for following the chariot, and then the cavalry, who always travel dismounted. They only ever mount when actually taking part in a battle, at least if these reliefs are anything to go by. We also have reliefs from Sennacherib's Siege of Lachish, which is recorded not only by Assyrian sources but also in the Hebrew Bible, as Lachish was a Jewish city that was destroyed by the Assyrians. And what you can see here is another fortified Assyrian camp. And again you have the Haruspex priests conducting animal sacrifices and divining the future from the slaughtered animal's liver. The rest of the camp is very similar to the fortified camps of Ashurnasirpal's time, with the rest of the camp being dedicated to the housing and maintenance of the soldiers. This relief is quite damaged, but again you can see the slingers out on the attack, and archers crouched behind their palisade shields, which appear to be made of reeds in this more detailed carving. Interestingly, in this carving we can see accompanying the army musicians, who appear to be playing lyres and are walking in procession with the rest of the army. I'm just speculating that this might be to do with keeping cadence as the army marches, which is what the Spartans used to do with a dual-headed flute called an ardos. Or it could be that these are musicians in the king's personal retinue and are simply paid to walk around with him, entertaining him. Approximately 50 years later we have a relief that was carved during the reign of King Ashurbanipal in around 640 BC of the king and his army preparing to go on a lion hunt. At the front are two young boys who appear to be standard bearers of some sort, and they're followed by the light infantry, who interestingly aren't carrying any shields. They are followed up by the heavy infantry with the large conical shields, which you can see in great detail here. It's interesting how the Assyrian army is always displayed in the same way, and at the rear of the army we have what, again, I'm presuming to be the veteran infantry, who have got their pavis shields, heavy armour and spears. I find it very interesting how little the equipment has changed over the few hundred years we've had displayed before us. Only the helmet is really noticeably different. As with all the other reliefs, when not being ridden in battle, the cavalry are walked along by their grooms and riders. Not being any expert on horses, I can't really tell you why this is with any authority, but if I was going to take a guess, I'd say it would be to keep them in top fighting condition for battle. So as you can see, a picture really does tell 1,000 words. So now that we know what the general composition of the Assyrian army was like, in the next video we'll have a look at the sort of things they got up to. The Assyrians had created the first professional standing army in all of history. To the Assyrians, war was their business, and they made sure that business was always very good.